different ways that birth is interesting. But on the physiology side, one of the interesting things about human birth is that unlike animal models, there isn't a single signal that triggers labor. Okay? So so different animals have been well studied in terms of the onset of labor. For some reason, sheep especially. But there's a specific physiological trigger. When a particular hormone goes up, it triggers labor, right? But in humans, the initiation of labor is this ambiguous thing where it's just a constellation of hormonal changes that start to prep the uterus for labor. Okay? And basically, as the preparation of the uterus goes underway, the rates of oxytocin production also increase. And oxytocin is going to be our primary hormone that's going to trigger those contractions to produce an effective labor. So you have this uterus that's becoming more and more competent to respond to oxytocin, and this oxytocin level that's increasing. And at some point you're going to hit a threshold where the uterus is responsive enough and you have high enough oxytocin levels. Okay? And then basically you're going to start labor. So the onset of labor is more gradual in humans, and interestingly, it's much more controlled by the fetus and the placenta than it is by mom's baby. Excuse me, by mom's body. Okay? So that the triggering of the hormonal events that creates that slow progression towards labor is actually initiated by the fetus and the placenta, okay, and not by mom. So some of the things that are changing is the relationship and the levels of three key hormones: progesterone, estrogen, and CRH. And if you remember, CRH is corticotropin-releasing hormone. It's a hypothalamic hormone. But in this case, in pregnancy, CRH, a lot of the CRH that's relevant to this discussion is coming from the placenta. Okay. So progesterone is a hormone that supports pregnancy. Right? So its levels predominate during the vast majority of pregnancy. So progesterone and estrogen levels are pretty high during pregnancy, but progesterone sort of dominates that mix between itself and estrogen. And so that's true for the first 32 to 33 weeks. Around 34 weeks, there are some changes that happen that make progesterone sort of take the second fiddle to estrogen. Estrogen starts to dominate. And part of that is that around 34, 35 weeks, estrogen levels are progressively increasing. Okay? And then CRH levels are also changing in that same window, around 33, 34 weeks. Okay? So before I show you sort of how those changes come about, let's just talk a little bit about what these different hormones do. So there are many reasons why progesterone supports pregnancy. It suppresses uterine excitement and contractility, including all other smooth muscle, right? So progesterone lowers smooth muscle tone. That has been a theme, right, throughout. It also, so not only does it make the uterus sort of quiet and less contractile, it also makes the cells, the smooth muscle cells in the myometrium, less likely to coordinate with each other. So progesterone downregulates genes that express what we call CAP proteins. And CAP proteins are proteins that make up gap junctions between smooth muscle cells in the uterus. Okay. So gap junctions are basically electrical synapses. They're found in the heart, right, between the muscles in the heart. and it allows for muscle cells to be electrically coupled and to basically contract together. Okay? And as you can imagine, in the uterus, muscles that are contracting in isolation to one another are not going to bring about the kind of forces that are necessary to expel a baby, right? But we have to create those gap junctions. So progesterone keeps those contractions isolated throughout the uterus. Okay? But as we're going to see, when the tide turns, those gap junctions are going to be produced and those cells are going to start talking to each other. Okay? And then almost all of the physiological adaptations in the body systems of mom during pregnancy is mediated, at least in part, by progesterone. Right? So progesterone plays a huge role in creating the physiological shift that accommodates for pregnancy. So around 33 weeks, progesterone production actually does not drop considerably, but the expression of what we call progesterone binding proteins increases dramatically. Okay. So the absolute level of progesterone is not dropping, but the availability of free progesterone in the blood goes down. Right? So these binding proteins go around and they start preventing progesterone from being able to act on any of the tissues. Okay? And then at the same time that happens, estrogen levels are going to start to rise. Okay? And so estrogen is going to start to dominate over progesterone in terms of its effects on mom's body. Now, estrogen has almost the exact opposite effect on, especially on the uterus, to progesterone. It enhances the production of those cap proteins and the formation of gap junctions between myometrial cells. Estrogen is also going to increase the expression of oxytocin receptors on the uterus and estrogen receptors on the uterus. Okay. So estrogen makes the uterus more and more receptive to estrogen, right, and to oxytocin. Estrogen also increases within the uterine wall, within the cervix. It increases the production of prostaglandins. Okay. Now, prostaglandins are playing a role in multiple areas surrounding labor, and we're going to sort of talk about all of those places. But one place that prostaglandins are acting are actually also on the myometrial wall, and they act very similarly to estrogen, increasing gap junctions, increasing oxytocin receptors, okay, and helping to prime that uterus for labor. Number 4, estrogen also is increasing intracellular calcium. Okay? And if you remember anything about muscle physiology, not with me, because I didn't talk to you about muscle physiology, but in your prereqs, right? And no matter where you have muscle contraction, intracellular calcium is critical for it. So estrogen is increasing intracellular calcium to increase the contractility of the uterine muscle. And it also increases, in number 5, it also increases the phosphorylation of myosin chains, which is, again, a contractile muscle protein that increases contractility. So 4 and 5 are just ways that estrogen is increasing the contractility of the uterus. Okay? So estrogen is making that uterus, the muscle layer, more coordinated by enhancing gap junctions, okay? And also more powerful by increasing the contractility, okay? And also more sensitive to oxytocin. Yeah.
So, during pregnancy with progesterone, we sort of see its action all over the body, in the gut and the uterus and the eggs. With estrogen, is that system-wide, like does it do all these systematically, or just in the uterus?
So all of these actions in the first 32 weeks are actually blocked because progesterone dominates. So throughout pregnancy, progesterone is tending towards relaxing muscle, and estrogen is tending towards enhancing muscle. But because progesterone is higher, right, it wins.
Right, but once the switch happens, is estrogen acting throughout the body?
Throughout the body, throughout the body. But especially in terms of oxytocin receptors and estrogen receptors and gap junctions, that's particularly to the myometrium. Okay? But in terms of enhancing excitability, that's throughout the body. Yeah. Okay? And if you go back to like the cardiovascular section, if you looked at the rise in cardiac output, you know, so early in pregnancy, it's more a rise in heart rate, and then towards term, it's a rise in stroke volume, right? And that's again because of this estrogen. CRH is actually corticotropin releasing hormone, and in terms of the rise in CRH during leading up to labor, it's coming from the placenta. Okay. Now this rise in CRH, you have a rise in CRH production by the placenta, and you also have mom's liver starts to produce less and less what's called CRH binding proteins. Okay. And this, again, this is at that critical 34, 35 weeks. Now, the net effect of that is that we have more CRH, more active CRH. Okay. Now, CRH is going to create changes that are going to help prime the uterus for labor, and at the same time accelerate the maturation of the fetus's lungs, okay, and metabolic organs in order to get this baby ready for birth. Okay. So CRH plays a really important role in triggering these events both in mom and baby that get get everybody ready for the big event. So CRH stimulates, number one, and we're going to look at this in more detail in the next few slides, but it stimulates the fetal adrenal cortex to release cortisol. And cortisol is going to really go to town on the fetal lungs to help produce surfactant and mature the lungs. Cortisol is also going to act on the liver to promote glycogen storage, right? So the baby has some glucose stores for extrauterine life. And the fetal adrenal cortex is also going to produce another glucocorticoid called DHEAS. And DHEAS is then going to get into the placenta and form estrogen. Okay. So much of the rise in estrogen that I just described is actually coming from DHEAS being converted to estrogen by the placenta. Okay. And I'm going to show you a couple of different pictures of that. So don't worry about grabbing all of that. Okay. And then oxytocin is also changing. We're also going to be producing more and more oxytocin as you actually, oxytocin is always there, right, throughout pregnancy. But your production of oxytocin is going up gradually as you're getting closer to labor. And oxytocin is a powerful myometrial stimulant, right? And it really plays a key role in the progression of labor. So since oxytocin is always there, and there's a variety of things that stimulate the production of oxytocin in anyone's body, including a pregnant woman's body, you know, so question is, why doesn't oxytocin cause early labor during the first 32 weeks of pregnancy? And really, the answer is the uterus isn't ready to respond to it. Right? The uterus really just is not ready to respond to it. And you also have progesterone really contributing sort of a net decrease in myometrial activity. Okay? So those last few weeks of pregnancy, that preparation of priming the uterus, decreasing the dominance of progesterone, really set up the stage for oxytocin to be able to cause the contractions necessary for labor.
I had a question. When I was in integration, we had a woman with a fetal demise at 24 weeks, 25 weeks, and she hemorrhaged after the baby was born, and the Pitocin didn't really do anything to stop the hemorrhage. Like, would that be for the same reason? Like, her uterus wasn't really primed for oxytocin yet?
So certainly, right? So the effect that Pitocin and oxytocin are going to cause contractions of the myometrium, but it's certainly not going to be as powerful as like a full-term uterus contraction. Yeah, she may have had other reasons, right? There's a variety of things that increase postpartum hemorrhage, but that's certainly, you know, that's certainly one of them. Yeah.
When you say that the uterus just like isn't ready to accept oxytocin, is that because the estrogen hasn't come in to like increase the receptors?
Yes. So the oxytocin receptors are not as doesn't have maximal density, and also those the contractions that oxytocin does cause preterm, especially earlier, tend to be these sort of isolated contractions, exactly, rather than these full coordinated contractions that are typical of labor. It's absolutely Braxton Hicks, but as you get closer to your due date, right, Braxton Hicks becomes sort of like rehearsal. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, no, Braxton Hicks tends to be these sort of false labor, yeah, and they can just feel like a tightening and a release, and yeah, they tend to be more. So women experience Braxton Hicks in a variety of ways. Some women don't really notice the Braxton Hicks until very, very close to term. But the Braxton Hicks is often described, and I can personally validate this. This is what it felt like. Is that it was just like your whole uterus tightening up, but like more prolonged. You know, not like a like typical contractions. It's a tightening and a release, and then it's sort of rhythmic. Anybody else have personal? Was that how you experienced it, Raffaella? Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and then like the hardening of your abdomen too, yeah. Okay, so this is a very sort of busy slide, and we're going to look at a less busy version of this in the next slide. But what we're looking at here is on the left column is the fetal compartment. So this is all fetal tissue. The center is like fetal membranes and placenta. So fetal membranes including like the amniotic membranes, all the membranes between the amniotic sac and the endometrium. Right? And then this is, on the right side is mom. So if we start with CRH, that's coming from the placenta, okay? So that's right here at the bottom. If we start with placental CRH, what we find is that placental CRH is acting on the fetal adrenal glands to promote the production of two glucocorticoids, cortisol and DHEAS. Okay. Now, cortisol is doing two things. It is acting on fetal tissue, so enhancing lung maturation, metabolic maturation, right? Glucose stores and that kind of thing, fat stores. And then cortisol is also acting on the placenta to enhance the production of placental oxytocin, to enhance the production of placental prostaglandins, and enhance the production of placental CRH. Right, so you can see we're setting up a positive feedback loop there. CRH, fetal cortisol, cortisol, more placental CRH. Right? And you can see that that's going to increase leading up to labor. Okay. Placental oxytocin is obviously going into mom and increasing activity of that myometrium. The prostaglandins are going into mom and increasing excitability, increasing gap junctions. Okay? And what those prostaglandins are also doing is it's going to start to set up the stage for cervical ripening. Okay? And then the other glucocorticoid, DHEAS, is also entering the placenta and being converted to estrogen within the placenta. And that estrogen is going into mom and enhancing oxytocin receptors, receptors for prostaglandins on the uterus, enhancing gap junctions, excitability. Yes. Actually, estrogen, oxytocin, and prostaglandin receptors. Okay. So another way to view this that's a little bit less busy is so the dividing line on the right is fetal, on the left is mom. Okay, that placental CRH acts on the fetal adrenal gland to produce cortisol, which, among other things, is going to promote fetal lung maturation, right, and metabolic maturity. And fetal adrenal glands are going to also produce DHEAS, which increases estrogen production, increases those gap junctions, oxytocin receptors, prostaglandin synthesis, enhanced contractions, cervical softening. Okay? And all of this is going to prepare, be in preparation for parturition or labor, and also promote the delivery of a healthy infant, right? Yeah.
Stress, is that what the contractions that are being caused that are adding on to the stress of the infant causing more cortisol release during labor, or is that a different stress?
It's actually a slightly different stress, right? So this little box that says stress that's contributing to the production of even more cortisol, the baby, as the baby gets larger and larger and gets closer and closer to term, the relationship between the placenta and the baby actually tends to deteriorate a little bit. So the baby is actually, the placenta is getting less and less efficient at delivering oxygen and glucose and everything the baby needs. So the baby is actually getting just a little bit more anxious, right? And that anxiousness, because he's outgrowing the womb, right? So that anxiousness also contributes to that rise in cortisol and the maturation necessary for delivering the baby. So when you get women with like placental abnormalities, that increase the likelihood for like intrauterine growth restrictions, that stress can actually cause a woman to go into labor much, much earlier, right? Yeah. Okay. So there's some detail missing in this one, but I just wanted to show a different view of this to make it a little bit simpler to look at. Okay. So as you can see, these changes in the hormones are sort of preparing the baby, preparing the uterus more and more, right? It starts off as a little bit, and then that preparation on both sides increase until finally just there's some change, right? There's a tipping point where labor ensues. So labor is, you just can't separate the physiology of labor from the physiology of the uterus, right? So if we just consider sort of uterine structure and function for a moment, we know that there are some different zones within the uterus. We've got this endometrial lining, myometrium, and then this connective tissue, this perimetrium, right? And the uterus, we know, undergoes very dramatic changes during pregnancy. Immediately upon fertilization and growth of an embryo into a fetus, you start to get enlargement of the uterus. And actually, early enlargement happens through things like hyperplasia and hypertrophy, right, of the myometrium and the endometrium. And it's actually not dependent on the growth of the baby. Right? Early growth of the uterus is completely driven by the rise in placental hormones. And then later in pregnancy, the growth of the uterus is going to be, again, through hypertrophy and hyperplasia, going to be dependent on the growth of the baby. Okay, so early on, it's really driven mostly through the hormones. Later on, the hormones support the growth, but that the growing fetus sort of promotes the growth of the uterus. And then, so if you compare the non-pregnant dimensions versus full-term dimensions of the uterus, right, there's tremendous changes that happen. So the uterus is going in terms of weight from being potentially 50 grams to nearly 1.2 kilos, right? Just the uterus minus baby. The volume of the uterus starts off in early pregnancy as being less than 300 cubic centimeters versus at term having 4,500 cubic centimeters, right? And the capacity, your non-pregnant uterus can hold about 10 milliliters of volume versus full term, you're talking about 5 liters of volume, okay? So very, very dramatic changes in the uterus across pregnancy. And then these myometrial muscles are basically going to do the job of expelling this infant out of the woman. So there are basically 3 layers to the myometrium. The outermost layer, which is shown over here, the outermost layer, the smooth muscle is arranged in sort of a longitudinal pattern. Okay? So the grain of the muscle is longitudinal on the outermost layer. Okay? The innermost layer, there's 3 muscle layers, the innermost layer is arranged in a circular pattern. Okay, so the grain is sort of circular. And then the middle layer, which is depicted on the right side of this slide, the middle layer, the fibers are actually arranged in a spiral pattern. Okay. Now, the difference in the arrangement of muscles is actually, and the enhanced contractility and coupling closer to term, are designed to eventually get this uterus to its most mature capacity, which is an incredibly muscular structure that's capable of generating muscle contraction so that the force is directed towards the outlet of the uterus. Okay? So, and there's a couple of different features that are really important for this. So number one, the density of smooth muscle is actually greatest at the fundus, at the top of the uterus. And then the muscle density gets less as you get closer to the cervix. Okay? So if you look at this slide here, this part of the slide, you see that there's like an upper segment of the uterus and a lower segment, right? The lower segment being closer to the cervix. So that upper segment has a higher muscle density than the lower segment. So the greater the muscle density, the greater the force of contraction. So if you're contracting at a greater force up high versus down low, it creates sort of a net force pushing the baby out. Right?
Is the uterus always configured this way, or is there remodeling?
It's always configured this way. The mass of muscle cells increases during pregnancy, and then the contractility and the electrical coupling it gets enhanced. But this is always the basic structure. Okay. Now, if you look at just the spiral arrangement of the muscles, you can see that for each of these spirals, you can see that, so for here, the force of contraction is sort of directed to the interior of the uterus, right? And the same on the other side. And then towards the lower segment, the force is directed downwards towards the cervix. Okay? Now this difference in muscle density in the upper segment versus the lower also becomes really important when you think about another property. When you think about another property of myometrial smooth muscle, which is something that we call retraction. And I'm just going to jump for a moment, and then I'll come back. I just want to talk about this really quickly for a moment before we move on. But individual myometrial cells have this very peculiar property that you don't see in other smooth muscle throughout the body. In other smooth muscle throughout the body, which is shown in A, smooth muscle cells, when they contract, they shorten, and when they relax, they go back to their original length. Right? That's contraction and then relaxation. With the myometrial cells in the uterus, the muscle cells contract and shorten, but when they relax, they don't go back to their original length. Right? They go back to a length that's slightly shorter. Okay? And so every time they contract, the resting length gets smaller and smaller. And what that functionally means is that the thickness of the uterine wall is getting thicker and thicker. And so the uterus actually can hold less and less the more waves of contraction. Right? So here's your hat, what's your hurry, right? Literally the uterus is pushing that baby out, both in terms of contraction and also, just we're making your home a lot smaller with every contraction, okay? So that retraction along with the directed force really helps that process of labor. This is just a picture of what these gap junctions look like between myometrial cells. So like all gap junctions, they are ion channels that basically connect one cell to the next. Okay, so this is the plasma membrane of one cell, and the plasma membrane of another cell. So that means that an action potential and the sodium that enters and the calcium that increases in one cell easily spreads to neighboring cells. And you get basically simultaneous contraction of neighboring muscle cells and the spreading of that action potential throughout the uterus. Yeah? It's particularly obvious in labor because of the repeated waves of contraction that are happening on top of one another. It is a property of the uterus that you'll see in non-pregnancy, but it's very rare to see the kind of persistent contractions in non-pregnancy that you see close to term, if that makes sense. So retraction is also somewhat temporary, right? So the muscle will eventually go back to its resting length when there's been a prolonged period of rest. So it's not like an elderly woman's, uterus is going to have a smaller capacity than a young person's. Yeah. Very good question. Okay. So the other thing that's absolutely critical for having sort of a well initiated labor are changes basically in the cervix, and these changes in the cervix are happening gradually along with the changes in the rest of the uterus as you get closer to term. So if we look at just the baseline structure of the cervix is really 90% connective tissue in the form of mostly collagen, and also a little bit of elastin, and then 10 to 15% smooth muscle. Okay? And collagen is really a connective tissue fiber whose job it is to provide strength, right? Tensile strength. So during pregnancy, the cervix actually has to be an incredibly tight and strong closure to ensure retention of the fetus. Okay. So during pregnancy, the cervix becomes extremely strong and tight, and you get this mucus plug at the cervical os. Okay, that's sort of maintained by progesterone. That mucus plug is maintained by progesterone. But then starting at that 33-week tide turning, the cervix begins to experience changes as well. So we start off with a cervix, as I said, 90% connective tissue, 10 to 15% smooth muscle. The connective tissue is mostly collagen. There's some elastin, right? And the elastin to collagen ratio is actually highest at the internal os. Okay, so the elastin is greatest at the cervical opening. Okay, which thank God for that, right? And then we also have this gel-like substance that provides a matrix. It's called proteoglycans. It provides a matrix that sort of locks those collagen fibers in place. Okay. And the smooth muscle is sort of found mostly at the surface of the cervix. Okay. And there's a little more smooth muscle at the upper portion of the cervix than the lower portion of the cervix. So during the first 35 weeks or so, that cervix of pregnancy is extremely tight and extremely closed. And then in that 4 to 5 weeks, the last 4 to 5 weeks, the structure of the cervix begins to change dramatically. And that change in cervical structure is initiated by that rise in estrogen, the rise in prostaglandins, right? All the hormonal changes that I described earlier. So what happens to the cervix? It increases in mass. It starts to become edematous. It starts to become highly vascularized. Okay? And what starts to happen is that the collagen fibers actually start to degrade. Okay? The prostaglandins trigger the release of these proteases, these enzymes that degrade protein, and they start to really break down the collagen in the cervix. So as the collagen breaks down, what you're left with is the smooth muscle and the elastin, and you're left with a cervix that has what we describe as ripening or softening. Okay. And usually what happens as women get closer and closer to term is that the depth of the cervix, or the length of the cervix, starts to shorten. We describe that as sort of effacement. It's sort of the thinning of the cervix. And then the size of the internal os starts to increase, right? Which is described as dilation of the cervix. Okay. And so some women leading up to their term, before labor, they experience a little bit more effacement and dilation than others. And some women experience a lot of effacement and dilation leading up to labor, and some women very little. Okay. But what's important to keep in mind is that cervical ripening is absolutely necessary for cervical dilation, and contraction of the uterus really does not cause cervical ripening. And the most important change that's happening that causes cervical ripening is the release of those prostaglandins. That's really the most important change. So this is that effacement and dilation that I was describing. So in A, we're looking at a cervix that's not effaced at all. So as we get further down, you get sort of a shortening, a thinning of the cervix, and then at the same time the cervix starting to dilate. Okay. And that production of prostaglandins that I described earlier, right, PGE2, especially PGE, PGE2, are going to be extremely important for triggering that cervical ripening. So, some women who are post their due date, they're into their 40th, 41st week. Some people will tell them, go home and have sex with your husband, and the prostaglandins in the semen will release, will help soften the cervix. So the prostaglandins in semen, which there are not the same prostaglandins that are ripening the cervix. Okay. What's that? But intercourse will increase oxytocin, and so it will increase the contractions, but it's not going to help soften the cervix. Yeah. But there are lots of different techniques to help stimulate cervical ripening. So what the interesting thing about prostaglandin production is that prostaglandins are always produced locally. So there's a lot of different things that are done to sort of stimulate, induce labor, including the stripping of the membranes, right? So stripping of the membranes involves sort of insertion of a finger into the cervix and sort of trying to detach some of the membranes from the uterine wall. And so what that does is it triggers the local production of prostaglandins. And there's also lots of prostaglandins in amniotic fluid. So another common way is an amniotomy, right, where they take the hook and they break the waters, and that releases lots of prostaglandins and helps to trigger cervical ripening and trigger labor. Okay. Almost every woman I know that's had her membranes stripped, she was not told, right, that she was getting her membranes stripped, including me. That when and I had a midwife. Yeah. So stripping of the membranes is actually a pretty common thing that's done to women who are like post date or getting close to their date, and their practitioner is getting nervous, and they're not always told that it's happening. You can feel it when they do it, but yeah. Which ones, I'm sorry? Yeah, those are the suppository ones. Yeah, those are going to strongly, yeah. What's that? Is it derived from swine? I don't know where it comes from. It's possible, but yeah. No, those are really, really strong doses of prostaglandins, and they're also going to trigger contractions, and yeah. Okay. All right. So physiologically, parturition is described as occurring in 4 phases, but these phases, only really the 3rd phase describes actual labor and delivery. Okay. And that the 4th phase actually describes the changes in the uterus postpartum, and that the phase in 1 and 2 really describe what's happening in the uterus during pregnancy. Okay? But since the uterus really goes through this all the 4 phases, for some reason that's described as phases of parturition. So this first phase, it's a 95% of pregnancy. This is the quiet phase, or quiescence, right? This is really the effects of progesterone. Contractility is low, gap junctions are low, and the uterus is sort of maintained as this sort of quiet place so that the fetus is undisturbed while it's growing. Okay. The second phase represents the last 4 to 5 weeks of pregnancy, when it's called the activation phase, and it's really the phase where we're priming the baby and we're priming the uterus for labor. Okay. This is that triggered by that rise in CRH, rise in estrogen, right? The drop in progesterone's dominance, and then all of those priming events on the uterus. Okay. And then number 3 is really the stimulation. So once we've primed the uterus, we now stimulate it with our oxytocin, and we have active labor. Okay? And so it includes all of the stages of labor, including the expulsion of the placenta. And then 4 is the involution, and we'll talk more about that in the postpartum period. But basically, once the baby is expelled, the uterus is still 4 or 5 times the size it was in pre-pregnancy, and it needs to sort of maintain constant contractions in order to sort of involute back to its original size. Okay. And that takes a much longer period of time, 4 to 6 weeks or so, for the involution phase to occur. Okay. And you can see sort of uterine contractility during these different phases. So it's obviously quietest during the quiescence period, represents 95% of pregnancy. The activation phase is that last 5 weeks or so, where uterine contractility is increasing. Obviously, uterine contractility is at its peak during the actual stimulation phase, during labor and delivery. But notice that the involution period, uterine contractility remains fairly high, right? Because it has to promote that, that returning of the uterus to its original size. Okay. So the actual stages of labor, labor is described as having sort of 3 basic stages. The first stage involving the dilation of the cervix. Okay. The second phase being the actual delivery of the baby, right? So it's the time between full dilation to birth of the baby. And then the third phase comes after the baby is born, and it's the period of time from the birth of the baby to the birth of the placenta. Okay. And these 3 stages of labor, there are many different things happening in these 3 stages of labor, and they work on very different time scales. So the initiation of labor, so the beginning of that first stage of labor, there's a couple of different sort of signs of true labor as opposed to false labor. The first being, and this can happen in a variety of sequences, right? But one of the hallmark signs is rhythmic and regular uterine contractions. Okay. And these contractions are often palpable, so you can actually feel the abdomen tightening. Sometimes you actually see the abdomen tightening depending on the body type of mom, right? Especially if women are pretty slight, you can actually see the contractions pretty visibly. The contour changes. And the thing with the contractions are that they don't go away when you rest. So a lot of times when women get closer to term, the Braxton Hicks sort of come on when you're sort of out and about and you're moving around. You can have more of these Braxton Hicks. But then if you relax, it tends to go away, right, when you rest. But when a woman is actually in true labor, those rhythmic contractions maintain their timing even at rest. Another common sign is show or bloody show. It's the passage of a little bit of blood. It could be actually the passage of sort of brown mucus or frank blood. It sort of varies in terms of what it looks like for every woman. Okay. But it's thought to be because of the bloody show is actually thought to be, it could either be the passing of the mucus plug, right? And in which case the mucus plug is going to kind of just look like sort of brown stuff, right? Mucusy stuff. But then sometimes the amniotic sac sort of detaches a little bit from the uterus, and you get sort of breaking of the membranes, and that's where the bloody show is about. Okay. Sometimes you can see the formation of forewaters, not always, but that's just sort of like a bubble of amniotic sac and fluid coming through the cervix. That's usually much later once the cervix is somewhat dilated. Okay. And then another important sign of the onset of labor is progressive dilation of the cervix. Okay. Assessed usually manually by the practitioner. So the first stage of labor, which is that stage of cervical dilation, is actually broken up into 2 phases. The first phase, which is the latent phase, and then the second phase is the active phase. Now, so this is taken from not the textbook that's required, but one of these British textbooks that I was telling you about last time. And this is sort of this is textbook, literally, right? Most OB textbooks, you open it up and this is what it looks like, where the latent phase is described as being, so this is cervical dilation versus hours of labor. So the latent phase represents the cervical dilation from 0 to 4 centimeters, or 3 or 4 centimeters. And then active phase is from 4 to 10. Okay. Now, as you can see, the rate of cervical dilation is slower in the latent phase than it is in the active phase. Right? And then there's something that is experienced by a lot of women that they describe as transition, when they go from that latent phase to the active phase. And that transition tends to feel like an increase in pain, an increase in the intensity and the frequency of contractions. Okay. And what we're looking at here in terms of the rate of and the duration of labor is what is projected for someone who is nulliparous, right, or prima-gravid, your first pregnancy. So the latent phase from the onset of labor should take no more than 8 hours. The active phase should take no more than another 8 hours, right? So from start to end, a well-behaved woman should start to enter her second phase after, no more than 12 to 14 hours of labor. So what's interesting about this is that this is really sort of used as the standard for interventions in terms of augmenting labor, right? So if women aren't on schedule, they're given a little Pitocin and sort of helped along. There was an interesting article that I found, the 2011, the citation is there, and they actually looked at healthy, uncomplicated pregnancies. Women compared basically the duration of their labors, especially the first stage of labor, to basically how dilated they were when they came in to the hospital. And they actually found, this is a very profound statement, is that despite the consistent management of labor by the staff, the rates of labor progress of women with the same cervical dilation on admission were so variable as to defy the identification of normality, right? So they found that for a woman coming in, prima-gravid, woman coming in at the same cervical dilation, some progressed really, really rapidly and some progressed very, very slowly, right? And what the graph here is showing is actually the median course of labor, and median is simply compared to mean is the most common, right, number. So if you look at all the different numbers for the duration of labor for a common cervical dilation, there will be one that will come up most commonly. And what they found was that the duration of the active phase, depending on the original cervical dilation, there was certainly a trend for shorter durations depending on how far along they are in terms of dilation, but you see that they're all in the active phase, that the rate of cervical dilation didn't stay the same like in that previous graph, right? They didn't have like a nice 1 to 1.5 centimeters per hour, right? So there were these like plateaus and jumps in cervical dilation. Okay? And that becomes very important, obviously, for making decisions about augmentation and making decisions about whether a woman actually does have delayed labor. Okay? Yeah.
So I'm assuming that the study was done without using any of the augmentations of labor?
Yes.
But
Yeah.
did they have like a cutoff, like if you got beyond this point, then they had to, well, I guess you probably got on this.
I didn't read it as carefully enough to be able to answer that question. But I believe that there's obviously inclusion-exclusion criteria, so they tried to get women that were all sort of like within a certain duration. But it's, so my point here is just to drive home that the cervix doesn't dilate like a machine that is how it's modeled all the time, right? There are sort of slow periods and fast periods even within the active phase. And there's a lot of factors that go into it. A lot of those factors we don't know. So this was also taken from that paper, and it's a histogram looking at the duration of the active phase based on the number of patients, the duration of the active phase, and their admission centimeters dilated, right? So you can see this pretty widespread from 0 hours, right, all the way to 17 hours of just the active phase, right? So huge variations. And then even in terms of the peaks in those histograms, it's pretty spread out, right? It's not they're not narrow histograms. So I found that very interesting. Okay, so there is a reflex that occurs during labor and delivery, especially during the active phase, during the active phase and the second stage of labor, called the Ferguson Reflex. It's a positive feedback loop that triggers oxytocin release in response to stretch on the cervix. Okay. So as the baby is pushed further and further into the cervix, and the cervix dilates more and more, that triggers a neuronal loop, right, into the spinal cord, up to the brain, that stimulates the release of oxytocin. Okay. Oxytocin then increases contractility, which causes the baby to cause more stretch on the cervix, right, which then feeds back to the brain and releases more oxytocin. Okay. So it's a positive feedback loop between stretch in the cervix and oxytocin release. And so that positive feedback loop is going to cause oxytocin to get higher and higher and higher and higher, and that's not going to stop until the baby gets expelled and the stretch on the cervix is relieved. Okay. So that transition that women experience is thought to be sort of an accelerated rise in oxytocin release and uterine contractions. Yeah. It's not a particular nerve. It's just, yeah, sensory nerves that are, yeah. With Pitocin? So one of the big differences in the endogenous release of oxytocin versus the application of Pitocin through an IV is, if you looked at oxytocin concentrations in the body of a pregnant woman in labor, you'd see these rises and falls. So oxytocin is sort of released in these waves in a pregnant woman that cause then waves of contraction, right, that start to get more and more frequent, but there's still waves. When you give an IV of Pitocin, you're actually sort of stabilizing the Pitocin levels, and the contractions become longer. So when the contractions are longer, the muscle experiences more ischemia, right? Because when it's constricted, it's not getting blood flow. The baby experiences more compression, which can affect how much blood flow it's getting. So because Pitocin is given sort of in stable amounts rather than the natural up and down of oxytocin, it creates a different kind of contraction that can, it's certainly much more painful for mom, Pitocin contractions, and potentially can cause distress to baby. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
So it's pretty much the same in the body, just levels of estrogen is what's altered, but the body can't differentiate.
It's binding to the same receptors and it's causing the same physiological effect. Yeah. I don't think that's true. No, I don't believe that's true, but I think that what may be happening is that one of the reasons why hormones get released in waves is because it can affect the cell's sensitivity to the hormone. So it could be that the uterus becomes less sensitive to the endogenous oxytocin because it's getting flooded with so much Pitocin, but your body's going to continue to produce the oxytocin. Yeah, and that's why it's described as augmentation when it's used in like low amounts. It's sort of to help make each contraction just a little more powerful. Yeah.
So why don't we just do this?
It's a really good question.
You have the technology, hormonal technology for all these, like pacemaker things and
Yeah.
things on rhythms. Why don't
It's an excellent question I don't have the answer to. Yeah. Why don't we delay cord clamping, right? Yep.
If a woman experiences cervical insufficiency early in pregnancy with this Ferguson reflex, is it the same?
No, because not all of cervical dilation is happening because of stretch, right? It's really not until the baby's head is really kind of pushing on and moving the cervix that the Ferguson reflex kind of initiates. Some textbooks actually describe the Ferguson reflex as being a stage 2 phenomenon exclusively. But women with incompetent cervixes, I hate that term, incompetent cervixes, but sort of a weak cervix, their cervix, just because it's not as tight doesn't mean that it's not triggering. Yeah, it's not triggering it. Okay. Okay, so it describes retraction. So the interesting thing, remember I told you that the muscle density in the upper segment is greater than the lower segment. So what that's going to do as labor progresses is it's going to create basically a very different thickness in the lower segment to the upper segment. Show you what that looks like. So it's actually going to start to create the birth canal because the upper segment is going to be very thick and it's going to start to be reduced in volume, right? The lower segment starts to thin out, right? And thin out and widen as the baby starts to move through, okay? And then the division between the upper segment and lower segment, you get this, what we call a ring of retraction, which is basically a very, two different rates of retraction that cause the upper segment to appear much thicker than the lower segment. Okay. So these waves of contractions that women are experiencing, the contractions tend to start in the fundus, and they sort of travel in a wave throughout the rest of the uterus. Okay? So these different lines are intramuscular pressure, a change in intramuscular pressure at these different places along the uterus. So the upper lines represent the upper uterus, The lower lines represent the lower uterus. So you can see that the intramuscular pressure is much higher and peaks higher in the upper segments than the lower segments, right? And so this is very similar to, you know, if you want to get toothpaste out of a toothpaste tube, right? You're going to have the best results by squeezing higher up and sort of moving out, right? And so that's what is happening in the uterus. So you see the peak of amniotic pressure occurs at the same time that the peak of muscle contraction happens, and that also the pain sort of happens around the same time. Okay? And we'll talk about what the source of labor pains come from, but part of the pain is actually visceral pain from ischemia of the uterine muscle when it sustains that contraction. Right? And also a big part of the pain, especially in that first phase, is coming from the cervical dilation. Okay. It's not. I'm not. It actually is very similar to a Charlie horse, right? I mean, it's. I mean, Charlie horse is like a tetanus kind of contraction. This isn't quite a tetanus kind of contraction, but it's you know, because that muscle is cutting off its own blood flow when it's in that contracted state. Yeah, you're just feeling that ischemic pain during the contraction. Okay. So that formation of the birth canal sort of happens at the end of that first stage, leading up to the second stage. The cervix is fully dilated. It's at 10 centimeters. Okay, and the baby's head is basically occupying that space at the lower segment, and it's going to start moving through, okay, and passing through the vaginal wall. Now, the actual birth canal is actually formed by the movement of the baby out. Okay, it actually gets formed by the movement of the baby out. And so for this line represents sort of the trajectory that the baby takes. And as you can see, it takes really this big turn. So it goes from the area of the uterus, it gets through the pelvic outlet, and then sort of moves up. Okay, that's assuming, obviously, when the woman is in a supine position. But it's going to take that turn no matter what position the mom's in. Okay. So at the time when labor begins, babies can present in a variety of positions. And I'm only talking really about like the variety of sort of normal positions. I'm not, you know, obviously there are fetal positions that are not normal, like breech or transverse, or, you know, but these are this is like the spectrum of sort of normal positions that are compatible with vaginal delivery without using. I know that a lot of other positions can be compatible with vaginal delivery with the right practitioner, but that is not always available. So basically the fetal positions are described in terms of the placement of the occiput, which is the that big protuberance in the back of your skull, okay, with respect to mom. So you can see that the occiput at either poles of this, north and south, that occiput can either be fully posterior, right, basically facing mom's spine, or fully anterior, facing mom's belly. Okay. And then everything that's not on the north and south is sort of an occiput that's slightly moved away from the midline. Okay. Now the most Common positions and the ones that are thought to promote sort of the easiest labor are the ROA or the LOA. And that's when, in both versions, the occiput is facing anteriorly, right? But on one case, the baby sort of shifted to the left. On the other case, the occiput is slightly to the right. Okay. Whether the occiput is anterior or posterior is thought to affect the duration and the ease of labor. And so basically, generally speaking, anterior babies are thought to, the labors are thought to go more quickly and more easily. Okay? And posterior presentations or positions are thought to go more slowly and potentially be more painful. So the anterior presentation, so one major reason is because when a baby the occiput is anterior, the presenting diameter of the skull is actually smaller than the presenting diameter, I don't know what's going on, than the presenting diameter of a posterior presentation. Okay? And it's thought to be potentially the difference of a diameter of 9.5 centimeters versus 11.5 centimeters, right? And for something that's already a really tight fit, that's a big difference. And then additionally, the posterior babies, thank you, the posterior babies don't tend to tuck their chin in when they're moving down, like the anterior babies do. And so if you can imagine, if your chin is tucked in, you're actually getting that smaller diameter too. The presenting part of the baby's skull is smaller. Okay? So that anterior presentation, that tucked in chin, is thought to provide, it's a smaller diameter, and it's thought to provide sort of nice constant pressure on the cervix. So that first stage of labor is thought to happen faster. Okay. And then with posterior babies, the baby's skull is actually oriented towards mom's spine. So as you can imagine, with every contraction, she's also having bone against bone, right against her spine. So that experience is described often as back labor, right? Yeah. 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 So some of them, I don't know the percentages of ones that turn versus don't turn, but the posterior babies, they can turn, and that enhances the labor, or they can come out posteriorly, right? My daughter was like this. Yeah, she was. Yeah, no, she came up sunny side up. Yeah. And it's funny because she was actually, this is just all, now I'm talking about me, not science, right? So she was actually LOA before the stripping, right? So the midwife stripped me. She looked at me, she saw somebody who was like kind of heavy. She thought that my baby was big enough and just wanted it to happen, right? So she stripped me, and then over the next like 6 hours, I could feel she turned, yeah. And then I had like 25 hours of back labor, and she came up sunny side up, yeah. But it was like, you know, that first stage of labor. I mean, I would labor for like 5-6 hour stretches and would only dilate like a ½ centimeter or something crazy. So, but then it accelerated a lot towards the end. So it was yeah. So certainly the posterior versus anterior. And you know, the entire idea that baby position affects progression of labor is actually not universally accepted, right, in obstetric circles. But it's something that has been, you know, certainly observed by many practitioners. Okay. So there's lots of negotiations and turns babies make as they're leaving. So as they're moving out. So and actually the best way to describe this, since we're running close to running out of time, there's a great video, sets of videos that I found and I posted on the discussion page. But basically it shows the maneuvers that the baby has to make in order to get out of the pelvis. So when humans decided to become human and walk on two legs, we went from having a pelvis that was very parallel, right, with a big outlet, like all the other animal species, to having a pelvis that was turned, so we can have all of these muscles to attach to our sides, so we can like walk upright. So what that did is it narrowed our pelvic outlet. So actually, the reason why human babies are born sort of 3 months early, meaning in terms of physical development at birth compared to almost any other animal, is because we wouldn't get out of we wouldn't actually be able to deliver them any later. Okay? So babies are actually born at like that perfect time. They have the most development, but their heads are small enough to still get out. So this is a little YouTube clip. And there's two of them sort of very, very similar, but it sort of shows the maneuvers that babies are making as they're moving out. And there's some funky background music, but you can ignore that. And of course, an ad. Yeah. So this is, so you got, yeah. So this baby's LOA, right? Pretty much. Cervix is dilating, he's descending. His chin is nice and tucked in. And you can see that right around here, he's got to move his head in order to get out, right? And then his head turns to that's called restitution. So if I just show you over here, go back to, so right here, when his head is turning, what's not happening, and it's in this slide, it's showing the body is moving as well, but really actually it's just the head that's moving. The body is still faced this way, right? So the baby just goes from here to like that, right? And then basically once the head is out, you get restitution. The head goes back to the sort of a neutral position with the body.
Was that the time you went for shoulders motion that you like get reaching the neck area and the head is turned to the shoulders?
Yeah, the shoulder now is behind the pubic bone, and if it's larger than normal, it's going to get, snagged on its way out. And then the very similar one that I also like is This one's really cool. What's neat about this one is that it actually shows you what's happening with the pelvic outlet at the same time. So you can see that the coccygeal bone's in the way, and then ooh, poor mom, right? And then, yeah, and then he's got to like kind of negotiate his head out. Okay. So it's amazing it ever happens, right? But so if you look at when you're going through the if you want to peruse these, this YouTube clip that's under the original topic, this is an amazing, really well produced birth of home birth that this couple did. I mean, it's like professionally produced. I don't know how. Like she had camera crews in her home, in her little apartment, while they were having this baby. But it's a really awesome video. It's only about 8 minutes long. And then this one is not a video of a birth, but it's this little news clip about Kim Kardashian and her birth, the different kind of birth. It's very funny if you watch it in sequence. She describes the most painful thing being the IV, you know, of the. Yeah. So very different point of view. Yes, no, so I'm going to get to that. So let me, I only have like 5 minutes left. So lots of different changes. So I'm going to, what's that? Is it? Oh. Is it that long? Or is it just going back and forth like a loop? Oh, it's a series, okay. I gotcha. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue a lot of this next week. I don't want to like cut short this lecture, but there's a couple things I wanted to mention before we end today. Okay, so let's talk about pain in labor, right? So yeah, labor hurts. And there's a variety of sources of pain during labor, and it can be kind of divided into visceral pain and somatic pain. So the visceral pain really comes from the uterus. It comes from the stretch on the cervix and the ischemia of the uterine muscle, and it's especially prominent in the first stage of labor. And then the somatic pain really comes from the trauma to the soft tissue in the birth canal, and the stretching of the perineum and sort of soft tissue pain. And different women have different thresholds for each of these. So some women describe the last stage of labor being not as painful as the first, right? So every woman experiences labor very differently. And then pain relief during labor comes in a variety of forms. So we've got sort of local aesthetic, anesthetics, thank you, like just applying lidocaine to the perineum to sort of ameliorate a little bit of that somatic pain. Regional anesthetics that are probably the most common in this country, epidurals and spinal blocks, or spinal anesthesia. General anesthesia, which is not very common, thankfully, anymore. My mom had general anesthesia when she had my brother. It's insane. Centrally acting opiates. So these are like IV drugs that are given to women to reduce the pain, like Demerol. And then, interestingly, not common in this country, but in almost every other industrialized country, are inhaled, short-lived dissociative drugs like nitric oxide. And that was that gassing of Chummy. If anybody likes that show called The Midwife, they demonstrate, right, nitric oxide. But basically, like in the UK, like 60% of women in labor take nitric oxide. And it's an inhaled, it's in every birthing room, right? And it's basically an inhaled mixture of nitric oxide and oxygen. And it's a dissociative drug. So, and the half-life is like 30 seconds. So you take a puff, and it doesn't take the pain away, but you don't care about the pain so much anymore. You know, if you don't like the effect, it's out of your system in 30 seconds. So it's been an extremely popular and widely used pain relief method during labor and delivery in almost every other industrialized country besides the U.S. I think in the U.S. there's only 3 hospitals. Yeah, which is funny because we love pain relief here, right? So, right. Yes, yeah. That's right. That's right. If you're not puffing it, you're not taking. It's totally woman controlled. There's also another video of like sort of a advertisement for a hospital that adopted nitric oxide, and I just recommend you watch it because it's hysterical. Just the woman taking the nitric oxide, it's just hilarious. So I recommend taking a look at that. So we just have a little bit left in that birth and labor lecture from last week. So we're going to end early today, so I'm going to talk about that, and then we'll end early. So where we left off, I'm going to sort of backtrack a little bit from where we left off. But I was talking about the effect of fetal position on the progress of labor. So that chart that I showed you about the different fetal positions, the most common and the ones that are thought to be associated with sort of a faster progress of labor are the ROA and the LOA, and that's where the baby's occiput, or the back of its skull, is facing in the anterior position, usually pointed either towards slightly to the left or slightly to the right, and obviously the baby's head is down. Okay. The positions that are thought to be associated with a more difficult and longer progress of labor is when the occipital bone is in the opposite orientation, where it's posterior. And facing mom's spine, basically. And the posterior position is going to most commonly be, again, either tilted slightly to the left or tilted slightly to the right. Now, the main reason why the anterior position is thought to be to progress better than the posterior position is because of really 2 major things. Number one, it's the size of the fetal head portion that enters the pelvic brim. Okay? That when a baby's head is LOA or ROA, but basically occipital in the anterior position, the baby tends to tuck his chin into his chest, and the circumference of the head that starts to enter the pelvis is smaller than the posterior. And it can be pretty dramatic. So the difference can be anywhere from about 9.5 centimeters with an anterior position versus about 11.5 centimeters in a posterior position. And in a basically something that's already a very tight fit, just a couple of centimeters makes a big difference. Okay? And then the babies that are in that posterior position, they don't tend to tuck their head as much. They tend to enter the birth canal with their head unflexed, okay? Which contributes to that larger presenting part of the baby's head. Okay. And then the anterior position also presents not only a smaller presenting portion, but also it's thought to, because the baby tends to move more easily, it's thought to provide more constant pressure on the cervix, okay, which allows for sort of timely dilation. Okay, rather than in the posterior position, the baby doesn't move as readily, and the pressure on the cervix is less consistent. Okay. And then you also tend to see less molding in the posterior babies. So the fontanelles of the skull tend, in a vaginal delivery, the baby's fontanelles tend to overlap slightly, so you get a little bit of head molding that facilitates fitting through the vaginal canal, fitting through the birth canal. But babies who are in the posterior position tend to undergo less molding. Okay? So their head looks pretty, but that also causes the progress to be a little bit more stalled.
But doesn't it take more effort to push those babies out? So like there's molding as like I thought it would be like more effort because it takes more time for the babies to go through the canal, right?
No, there tends to be less molding because of the position that their heads are in when they're going through the birth canal. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, you know, fetal position, and a lot of babies who are posterior will turn and become anterior as they get delivered, but not always. So for a baby being delivered, a normal healthy baby being delivered in a sort of the most common mechanism, so the baby's head is in that occipital anterior position. In this picture, what we're looking at is actually a baby who's sort of occipital transverse. So it's towards the front, but it's more transverse rather than tilted one way or the other. Okay. So, and you can see that as the baby enters the pelvic brim, it undergoes this thing called compaction, where the baby tucks his chin into the chest, okay, as he moves down the birth canal. And then as he descends down the pelvic brim, he moves further and further down. And then at some point, the baby, in order to negotiate the coccygeal bone that's coming out there, the baby turns its head. Okay? So it moves down, it turns its head, and then it sort of lifts its head up as it gets born, okay, as it comes out. So you can see that the baby's head is in a different position compared to its body in order to negotiate that coccygeal bone. So then it, as I said, it moves past that coccygeal bone, it lifts its head out as it gets born, okay, as the head is delivered. And then you get this, what's called restitution, which is the baby's head turns to be sort of neutral with where the body is positioned. Okay? And then the rest of the baby's body is delivered after the head and after that restitution. Okay? I don't know what's buzzing here. So this baby that's being born is in that sort of classic, most common occipital anterior position. But a baby who's in the posterior position that doesn't turn is going to be right sunny side up. Is going to be face up when they're coming out of the birth canal instead of face down. Okay. Sometimes when that happens, you can see a little bit of bruising on the face because the baby's head hits against the pubic bone.
What's happening with restitution?
With restitution, so you see the baby's head is delivered, but the baby's head So the baby is positioned like this, turns its head and gets born like that, right? And then restitution is just when the baby's head is outside the woman's body, it becomes neutral with the position of the body. So it untwists.
Neutral with its own body?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, with its own body.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then the baby's body can rotate a little bit before it gets born. Okay. So we'll just look at that that little video one more time just to see this the process. And please feel free to stop and ask me anything you want as we're going through this.
Sunny side up as if your face is facing you.
Yes,
Usually it's the back of the head.
exactly. Yeah. So the baby's entering that pelvic brim, it's moving down, right? And you can see its head with respect to that coccygeal bone. Okay. So you can see, so the one thing that this movie shows that is not entirely accurate is that the baby, instead of just moving its head before it pops out, it's rotating its whole body, right? So the body rotation tends to happen after the baby's head is out. Right, and there's the rotation that they're describing. Okay, so a lot is going on as labor progresses in both mom and baby, and this is a pretty no-duh statement, but labor and delivery is stressful, right, for mom and baby. The stress on mom's body for women with pre-existing problems like hypertension, like any degree of cardiac failure, respiratory problems, renal or urinary problems, the stress of labor and delivery can actually be quite compromising. But for most women, they can tolerate the stress of labor and delivery. On the baby's end, the vast majority of the time, the babies tolerate that stress of labor and delivery well. And in fact, some of the stresses of labor and delivery are actually protective, and they actually help to stimulate the baby's sympathetic nervous system, which actually primes that baby for extrauterine life. Okay? So the stress of labor and delivery for both mom and baby are not necessarily a bad thing. Okay? So mom's cardiovascular system, a lot has gone on from the minute she became pregnant until the minute she delivers this baby. A lot has gone on in mom's cardiovascular system. So, and if you've been keeping track, right, her blood volume has expanded, her cardiac output even before she gets to labor is increased, and then as soon as she gets into labor, cardiac output increases and it continues to increase. Right? Even to the point after she delivers the baby, her cardiac output increases. Okay? So that means that her heart is working very, very hard throughout pregnancy, and especially during labor and delivery. Okay? So with each uterine contraction, cardiac output increases by about 10 to 15%. Okay? And then we're not talking about an additive effect, we're talking about sort of a bump in cardiac output at the end of every contraction. And part of that is actually because due to pain and anxiety, right? That sort of stressful part of labor and delivery. When women are in a supine position, they tend to experience a lower cardiac output, a lower stroke volume, but a higher heart rate. Okay? So their hearts are working hard, but they're not necessarily as efficient at pumping the blood out of the body. Okay? And we know this, right, because a supine position for women really beyond the first trimester is not an optimal position for women to be in for any period of time, right? It puts pressure on the abdominal vena cava, and it compromises venous return. So supine position during labor is no more beneficial to mom than it is any other point during pregnancy. Okay, so a side lateral position during labor is a much better position for cardiac output and stroke volume, as is almost any other position. With the increases in cardiac output, mean arterial pressure also increases. Okay? So mom's blood pressure is increasing also throughout labor. So the systolic blood pressure can increase by about 35 millimeters of mercury, which is substantial. And diastolic blood pressure can increase by 25 millimeters of mercury in just the first stage of labor. And in the second stage, you see even higher elevations in blood pressure. Okay. In the respiratory system, mom's oxygen demand and consumption increases with every wave of uterine contractions. Right? So there's an enormous amount of oxygen requirements to drive the uterine contractions. And through especially the first stage of labor, anxiety and pain has often caused mom to hyperventilate. So her respiratory rate is usually very high, her PCO2 tends to get lowered, and she tends to be in a state of respiratory alkalosis during that first stage of labor. Now that tends to change as the second stage of labor comes on because there's a lot of breath holding during the pushing phases of the second stage of labor. Okay? So that respiratory alkalosis during the first stage is sort of compensated or compensates for the respiratory acidosis that's happening at the second stage of labor. Okay? And then within 24 hours postpartum, mom's pH balance is completely restored. Okay. Mom's immune system, the major thing that we see is women tend to have very elevated neutrophil counts just during labor and just before labor. So we're talking about white blood cell counts that increase by 25 to 30,000 cubic millimeters. Right, cells per cubic millimeter. And it's mostly because of a stress-induced elevation in neutrophils. Okay? So labor and delivery represents a potential time of high risk for infection. So it makes sense that mom's neutrophil count would be very high going into that period of time. And usually the neutrophil count will go down, white blood cell count will go down, normalize over the next couple days postpartum. Now, part of the stress and anxiety of pregnancy is the pain involved in labor, and there's a variety of sources of pain depending on the stage of labor. In general, the first stage of labor, the pain is coming from the dilation of the cervix. Okay? It's also from the stretching of the lower segment of the uterus, and also the pressure on adjacent structures as the uterus contracts, and hypoxia from the uterine muscles during contraction. Okay? Women who get sort of augmentation through Pitocin during that first stage of labor, the contractions tend to get stronger and longer, and so the pain tends to be much more intense, especially due to the hypoxia of the uterine muscles. In the second stage of labor, again, we've got a lot of intense contractions. So a lot of hypoxia. The contractions are also getting longer and stronger in the second stage. So hypoxia continues. But then we also start to see distension of the vagina and the perineum, and that sort of soft tissue pain, and the pressure on adjacent structures. Okay? And in the third stage, after the baby's actually delivered and you're delivering the placenta, the third stage pain comes from uterine contractions, from the cervical dilation to pass the placenta, and also from whatever sort of traumatized perineal tissue that from the delivery of the baby as the placenta passes through. So in the fetus can respond to labor in a variety of ways. So the most common is that the baby tolerates it well. Most babies are certainly strong enough to tolerate the stress of labor. And so among those babies, they see heart rate changes during labor. And the most common changes that we see in a healthy labor is that the baby's heart rate will tend to decelerate in time with contractions. Okay? And we call those early decelerations, and it's usually because, it's thought to be because of compression of the head during contractions. That sort of leads to those transient decreases in heart rate. And we'll talk about some other patterns that are less reassuring than the early decelerations in just a moment. The baby is also going to undergo some significant acid-base changes during labor. There is a slow decrease in pH as labor progresses. So the baby is becoming more and more acidotic. And that's mostly because of a decrease in blood flow to the fetus during the peak of contractions. Okay. The peak of contractions, they cut off blood flow to the uterine arteries, which feed the umbilical artery. Okay. During the second stage of labor, fetal pH decreases further as mom holds her breath. Okay. This acidosis is actually important for the baby. Okay, so the fetal acidosis is actually important because it really wakes up the baby's chemoreceptors, the ones that control breathing. Okay. So that baby becomes slowly acidotic over the first stage, a little bit more acidotic right before it enters the world, and then when it gets into the world, the chemoreceptors are screaming from that acidosis, and it really helps to make that first, most effortful breath successful when the baby's born. Okay. Fetal sensations. So the fetus is experiencing a lot over the course of labor, right? So, and it's going through a lot all through that first stage of labor. Its head is trying to get through the cervix. It's getting pounded on with every wave of contraction. It experiences these drops in blood flow during every wave of contraction. Okay? And then as the baby is passing through the birth canal, it's getting compressed and it's getting sort of physically stimulated as it passes through that birth canal. Okay? When a baby passes through, when a baby's born vaginally, it also gets squeezed on, right, as the baby's body moves through. And that, especially when it squeezes on the thoracic cavity and the abdomen, it helps expel some of the fluid that's in the lungs. Okay. So all of that sort of physical manipulation that happens, or the physical sensations on the baby as it passes through the birth canal and gets into the world, really helps trigger this activation of the baby's sympathetic nervous system.
So how does that work with C-section?
Yeah, so let me say that in just 1 second. So, so the baby gets out into the world, it's getting tossed and tumbled and squeezed, and it's pushed through the birth canal, and then it gets out into the world, its sympathetic nervous system turns on, it takes this really effortful big first breath, right? And that sympathetic activation triggers, we're going to talk about this more in the neonatal section, but that sympathetic activation encourages the baby's liver to release glycogen stores. It encourages the baby's adipose tissue, especially the brown fat, we'll talk about that, to help regulate the baby's body temperature. Okay. So that rude awakening, that stress of birth, really helps wake up this baby's organ systems to really turn on for extrauterine life. Okay. So babies that are born through cesarean, they don't get manipulated like that, right? And so if you've ever seen, you all have seen a baby born vaginally versus a baby born through C-section, right? When a baby is born through C-section, they tend to sort of more rigorously dry them off and manipulate them in order to help trigger that sort of like the sensations. But the babies that are born through C-section, they tend to be more subdued when they're born than babies that are born through vaginal births. Right.
But I feel like, you know, what if there is the fetal benefits and have those been weighed out?
Well, I think the fetal benefits of a vaginal birth are don't tend to be focused on by clinicians very much, because the focus tends to be on. I mean, I'm talking my personal opinion here now. The focus tends to be on minimizing liability and increasing, just maximizing producing sort of a baby that is well in the end. Yeah, yeah. There isn't an appreciation for, or at least there isn't an emphasis on the benefits of a vaginal delivery for the baby. There's a focus on the idea that babies are little and weak and that birth is stressful, right? And not that birth is stressful by design, right? Yeah. Okay. So third stage of labor, about 15 to 30 minutes after the baby is delivered, usually the placenta also is delivered. So very shortly after the baby is delivered, there's another round of uterine contractions that ensue. And those contractions encourage the placenta to detach. Okay? And the placenta will detach on its own. It doesn't need sort of pulling or coaxing, although you see practitioners do that a lot, right? And actually pulling and coaxing increases the risk of sort of, pieces of the placenta that don't detach on its own. So the placenta will naturally detach on its own, and then those uterine contractions help that detachment, but even more importantly, help clamp down on those uterine spiral arteries that, remember, were very low resistance vessels that couldn't contract on their own, right? They couldn't constrict on their own. So the uterine contractions are extremely important for the minimization of blood loss when the placenta detaches, okay? Because that detachment site, that placental site, is really going to represent, in that postpartum period, a fairly significant wound, right, that needs to be healed. And that placental attachment site actually heals much later than the rest of the intrauterine wall. Okay. So, just going back, go ahead. Yeah.
They had like di twins where there's two placentas.
Right.
When the first baby is delivered, does the placenta detach, or does it wait until the other baby is delivered? And then if it did detach, would you have excessive bleeding before the other? How does that work? Like clamping down if you clamp down too early on the placenta,
Yeah.
too late on the placenta?
I'm not, I don't know a whole lot about how multiple gestation deliveries occur normally. But usually the time between deliveries is fairly short. It's usually like just 1 to 5 minutes between deliveries. So the placenta is going to take usually a minimum of like a good 10 to 15 minutes to detach. So that that the placenta of the unborn, siblings, is likely not going to detach before that baby is going to be. Right. It's unlikely that any of them are going to detach before they're, yeah. And with multiple gestations, the babies tend to be a little bit smaller, so the births tend to be a little bit done more easily. But you also have the risk of like one baby's positioned well. Yeah, exactly. So.
First twin came out, cut the cord like right away, and marked it, like they like marked the cord or whatever. Baby came out, his baby came out like 3 minutes later. They didn't cut that baby's cord right away because the mom had asked for them not to cut either cord, whatever. But they like put the baby, no, not whatever, but like,
Yeah.
they had to cut the first baby's cord
Right.
quickly to make sure the other baby was going to be okay. But they did the second, and then as soon as they cut that one, they marked that one so they could keep track, and then they both came out within like 30 seconds of each other.
Oh, that's interesting. So the babies came out within 30 seconds of each other.
Babies came out within minutes of each other.
Within a minute.
Came out like bang, like after they. It was interesting.
Well, that's interesting that they would clamp the first cord very, very quickly. So I guess to maximize blood flow, that's going to the sibling rather than to the.
Because they were like this, they were hesitant about delivering vaginally anyway, even though they were both like vertex, and so when the first baby came out, they were concerned about the state of the second baby, so they wanted the first baby like out of the way.
Get that kid out of here. Right.
It was
Right.
and like it was very it was crazy.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
managed to do that was awesome.
And this was a physician birth. This is a yeah. Yeah. Because there's also not yet an appreciation for delaying that cord clamping, right? That like there's not yet an appreciation universally for like delaying cord clamping. So they might not have even been a factor in.
Yeah, I mean the mom was very naturally minded. Like she didn't have any pain meds or anything. She was and so she was already kind of made scenes like
Right. A crunchy granola, crazy girl. Yeah. 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 That's really. So just backtracking a little bit, as I mentioned, the changes in the fetus, the most common changes that you're going to see in terms of the heart rate in a healthy labor is what we call early decelerations, which are drops in blood pressure, drops in heart rate, fetal heart rate that tend to occur at the same time that contractions occur. And usually the drops in heart rate are modest. They're not usually really dramatic. Heart rate drops that are dramatic are worrisome, okay, whether they happen in time with contractions or not. So sort of reassuring signs are baseline heart rates that are sort of above a good criteria, and I want to say that above 120, above 130 are sort of reassuring, like a baseline heart rate, and then decelerations that are modest and not dramatic, and decelerations that occur in time with contractions. Okay. There is a normal variability in the baby's heart rate. So when the baseline is being assessed, So in between contractions, the heart rate undergoes normal fluctuations, right, that are really random and usually tiny. Okay, that's also very reassuring. That's just called sort of spontaneous heart rate variability in the baby. That's also very reassuring. When the heart rate starts to become less spontaneous and become more smoothed out, that becomes less reassuring. Okay? And it can indicate some uteroplacental insufficiency, so some abnormal relationship between the umbilical blood flow and the placenta. So some less reassuring changes in the heart rate. So you see mom's contractions are here in these waves, and then the fetal heart rate is decelerating towards the end of the contraction. And that, described as late decelerations, are, it's an abnormal pattern, okay? Thought to be about the uteroplacental insufficiency. So basically poor blood flow through the placenta to the umbilical cord. And you notice also that the baby's, that heart rate line has sort of smoothed out, right? It's less spontaneously active. And then also not reassuring are large variable decelerations in heart rate. So these are decelerations in heart rate that can happen really at any time. They can happen with contractions, before contractions, after contractions. They tend to be fairly large drops in heart rate, and they are more consistent with cord compression. Okay. And what often happens with cord compression, so you can see the cord compression is going to happen in time with a uterine contraction. And so what you might see is, so down here you see the umbilical cord, and you can see the blood flow through the umbilical cord is going from full to less than full to somewhat occluded and then back to full. And then you can see as the uterine contraction progresses, there's this, during the partial occlusion periods, you may actually see an increase in heart rate. Okay, that's sort of a compensatory response to a drop in blood pressure in the baby. But then at that peak of cord compression, you see a large drop in heart rate. So that's a very non-reassuring sign, okay, and may be a reason to declare fetal distress and push for intervention. Okay. Okay. So we talked about the pain, and I talked a little bit last time about pain management during labor and delivery. Now, so pain, the experience of pain during labor and delivery, it is very real, right? But at the same time, people, and whenever you're talking about pain, you're talking about a fairly subjective experience, right? So depending on your level of fear, right, we talked about pain and patho, that there's a lot of sort of descending modulatory pathways that really affect how we experience pain. So anticipatory fear literally makes the experience of pain more intense, right? So things like anticipatory fear, as opposed to having the anticipation that you're going to be able to manage it well, right, also modulates pain. And then some women experience more pain than others, depending on the way their labor progresses. And certainly there are there's a wide variety of non-pharmacological interventions that can be used to reduce pain or manage pain during labor. One of the ones that's shows sort of the biggest effect is submersion in warm water, right, or hot water. It tends to reduce the experience of pain quite significantly. Things like controlled breathing and imagery and sort of distraction methods also certainly help. Okay? But that sort of fear factor, right, can really be a very, very significant part of whether a woman feels like they can sort of survive or tolerate the pain versus they can't. And that a lot of that fear can really come from feeling like this is either something that is in the control of somebody else or that's in her control, right? But in terms of sort of pharmacological sources of pain management, I talked about this a little bit before. Lidocaine can be applied to the perineum. Lidocaine's no match for a baby coming out of your perineum, but it can certainly help with repairing of tears, especially if they're not too high degree of a tear. Regional anesthetics, by far the most common pain management in this country. Epidural, spinal anesthesia. I will never forget my experience of birthing my daughter at a hospital where I was the only woman walking around that floor, and I was the only woman screaming on that floor. Right? So I didn't know what they had, but I wanted it at the time. But my husband assured me what they had were epidurals, so then they weren't walking around because of that, which was okay with me at that point. But it's incredibly ubiquitous. The use of epidurals are incredibly ubiquitous. And the use of an epidural, I've known women who've had births that have sort of gone on for a prolonged period of time, and that they sort of hit a wall, and that getting an epidural helped them rest and actually get over that wall. And so, you know, by no means am I you know, I'm not trying to you know, invalidate the use of an epidural, but it's certainly the most common. And when women get epidurals, in terms of their how their body works, what's the most common side effect when women get an epidural? Hypotension, right? So the blood pressure goes down, so you can imagine the blood pressure goes down, the perfusion pressure to the uterus goes down, so that has to be adequately managed, right? So an epidural is certainly not without its risks to mom or baby. General anesthesia, very uncommon these days, but not so uncommon just a couple of decades ago for like a normal vaginal delivery even. Centrally acting opiates like Demerol, Methergin, these are less widely used, especially Demerol, because there's been studies to show that postpartum breastfeeding tends to happen with more difficulty when Demerol was used. And the thought is that babies that are born by mothers who have had Demerol, especially closer to the time of birth, may be a little bit more lethargic and may not latch well immediately after delivery. So there's some questions about that. And then, as I mentioned previously, that the one form of pain management tool that is basically non-existent in this country, but very, very widely used in the rest of the industrialized world is nitric oxide, which is an inhaled volatile gas. It has a half-life of 30 seconds. It's out of your body in 30 seconds. And it's a dissociative. So basically, the side effects are basically sort of feelings of slight sleepiness, mild euphoria, but the pain doesn't go away. It simply it falls into the category of drugs where the pain is there, but you just don't care, kind of thing, or you care less than you did before you had the nitric oxide on board. All right. So it's a very short-lived dissociative, and it's entirely controlled by mom, right? So she inhales when she wants to. She inhales as deeply as she wants to. Okay. So, any questions about? Yeah, please.
Is the reason that nitric oxide is widely considered that a reliability issue, or is it
It's really not clear why it fell out of favor. I think that it was used. It was more widely used at one point. Somebody was telling me this story. Was it? Yeah.
It was used from like the 1920s to I think about like the 1940s. It was used in the hospital, but then there was some controversy or whatever surrounding it, and it stopped being used. And then the epidural was invented, so then it never got a chance to come back and become popular in favor. And so because the epidural and other pain management interventions that are used better and more effective, they just never decided to go back. And then of course billing, because like it's not very expensive to have a canister of nitric oxide beside your oxygen tank.
So some of the things that you come across when you hear about like the downsides of nitric oxide is the risk of like overdosing, right? Because it's controlled. But that in the rest of the industrialized world has been worked out by controlling the formulation, right, of the gas. So it's usually a combination of nitric oxide and oxygen. So if the combination of those two drugs are appropriately mixed, you really prevent the possibility of overdosing. So no, it's got to, unless the hospital has it available. So this was, did anybody manage to watch this thing that I was telling you guys about? Go ahead, Elizabeth, what were you going to say?
I was gonna say that I think I now kind of remember. I think it was like they had it strapped around their faces like the oxygen mask, but you're just supposed to hold it, and then if you like get too much, then you just end up sort of passing out for a few seconds and it drops. So like I guess like the risk of the moms putting it around their head and just keeping it going at all times is the likely.
a couple of hospitals in San Francisco now recommend it, but
Yeah, it's only like a handful of places here in New York that now have it.
it's like illegal.
They could do it. It's really just about making it available, right? So if you've, what's that show, the British show, the Midwives? Not the Call the Midwives, the modern day one. I think it's just called The Midwives. You see, like in every one of these births, women are sucking on this white thing, you know, and they're all using nitric oxide, right? And in the UK, it's something like 60% of women will elect to use nitric oxide, but also because it's in every labor room, right? Yeah, they're not. There's a lower, no, they're not, the ones that are having an epidural are not electing to use a nitric oxide because they're not experiencing the same level of pain. Yeah, yeah. But no, and in that, you know, if you watch clips of, I could pull up literally a random clip of this show, it's called The Midwives, that every single birth you see, whether they're in a tub or a bed, the women are sucking on nitrous, you know. So this is a hospital, gosh, I don't know where, but you know, one of their selling points, or one of the only hospitals, yeah, I don't know where that is, but there's only like 3 hospitals in the United States that offers. Is it Massachusetts? Yeah, and like this is their ad, right? So they're so she looks very happy birthing her baby, right? is really very funny. And what's interesting is when you watch those clips of the women using it in the UK, they're still going through a lot of pain, right? They're still like, I mean, especially in the active stage of labor, they're still going through a lot, but they just seem to be managing it better, right? Yeah, yeah. So it's an interesting thing, right? Why American women can't seem to get their hands on this, but so that's all I have for you today.